The first thing Dalen Prescott noticed when he stepped off the shuttle was the smell. Acrid. Sterile. Burnt ozone laced with something metallic. The planetary medical outpost on Kirell 4 wasn't designed for comfort. It was functional, ugly even, a squat dome half buried in red sand with thin spires of antennae reaching into the cloudless sky. He adjusted the strap of his duffel bag and made his way toward the main entrance. The twin suns beat down on his back, and grit scratched against his boots with every step. Inside, the temperature dropped sharply. The lighting flickered once overhead. "Name and assignment," said a voice from the reception console. Dalen Prescott, civilian interspecies veterinarian, assigned under the Terran-Kirell exchange program. The receptionist, a segmented creature with 6 eyes and a pale green carapace, scanned his clearance disk without looking up. "You're late. I had to land in a dust storm. The pilot didn't feel like dying. Bay 8. You're covering for the Zarnak unit." Dalen nodded once and made his way down the corridor, dodging a cart of surgical tools pushed by a lanky, bird-like alien trying to balance 3 data pads in its elbows. The place buzzed with activity. Wounded creatures, some familiar, others not, lined the triage ward. A sobbing child of a species Dalen didn't recognize clutched a splintered limb, while a med tech sprayed foam over a deep gash on another patient's side. Bay 8 was dim and reeked of antiseptic. A tall Kirell stood beside the operating table, its 4 arms crossed in a disapproving gesture. "You're the Terran?" the Kirell asked. "Dalen, you, senior vetrician Hecker, you've walked into a disaster. Isn't that the whole point of being assigned here?" Hecker gestured to the surgical table. A large creature was sprawled across it, unconscious. Its black fur was matted with blood, and a deep gash ran down its side. The creature's chest rose and fell slowly, but its breathing was ragged. Dalen stepped closer. "What is it?" "A Graleth. Apex predator from the jungles of Ternis 3. This one was brought in by the planetary patrol, found tangled in razor vine, half dead. The others refused to touch it. Others? The Xeno Veterinary Corps. They won't treat predators. It's protocol." Dalen blinked. "Wait, they refuse treatment based on species? It's considered too dangerous and unnecessary. The Graleth is not domesticated, not a companion species, and therefore not prioritized for medical intervention." Dalen leaned over the table, examining the wound. The gash was deep but not fatal. Ribs were exposed. One eye was swollen shut. The creature twitched weakly, its claws flexing. "We can save it," Dalen said. Hecker tilted his head. "You're serious? I didn't fly across 3 systems to draw lines around what life is worth saving. You'll be doing it alone. My staff won't assist." "Then get out of my way." Dalen scrubbed up, pulled on gloves, and activated the surgical interface. The tools hovered into place. He stabilized the Graleth with a sedative cocktail tailored to mammalian physiology. The vitals monitor beeped erratically as he worked, sealing the wound with dermal bind and reinforcing the cracked ribs with biofoam. Sweat poured down his face beneath the sterilization mask. The procedure took 4 hours. By the time he stepped back, his hands were trembling. The Graleth slept, breathing slow but steady. "You'll be responsible for it," Hecker said from the doorway. "I figured." Dalen returned the next morning and every morning after to monitor the Graleth's progress. He named it Varrek. The creature remained sedated for 2 days, then began to stir. On the 3rd day, it tried to stand and collapsed. Dalen kept his distance, observing from behind a reinforced barrier. On the 5th day, Varrek opened both eyes and growled when Dalen entered. Yeah, Dalen muttered. "You're welcome." He tossed a slab of protein meat into the containment area. Varrek sniffed it, then devoured it in 2 bites. Over the next week, Dalen adjusted the creature's medication, monitored its vitals, and collected data on its regenerative abilities. He logged everything: wound closure rates, appetite, behavioral responses. Varrek remained hostile but didn't attack. Dalen moved cautiously, never assuming safety, but never retreating either. The other vets watched from a distance with a mix of curiosity and disdain. "You're going to get torn apart," muttered a year-old nurse one morning. "Maybe," Dalen said. "But not today." 2 weeks later, Hecker summoned him to a security meeting. The Graleth escaped containment last night. Dalen froze. "Is it loose in the facility?" "No. Patrol drones tracked it to the outer ridge. It didn't attack anyone. Just ran." "You're going to kill it, aren't you?" "We can't risk it returning. I'll bring it back." "You're not trained for field retrieval." I've been with it every day for 2 weeks. It knows me. Against protocol and better judgment, Hecker authorized a retrieval attempt. Dalen suited up, armed with a tranquilizer gun and a medkit. A drone dropped him near the ridge, where the terrain was steep and scattered with jagged rocks. He found Varrek limping near a dry stream bed. The creature growled when he approached. "Easy," Dalen said, lowering the weapon. "You're hurt again." Varrek bared its teeth. Dalen took a step forward, hands open. "I didn't patch you up just to watch you bleed out in the desert." Varrek lunged. The impact knocked Dalen off his feet. He hit the ground hard, the side of his head smacking a rock. Stars exploded behind his eyes. He rolled, trying to get up, but pain shot through his ribs. He gasped and collapsed again. Varrek stood over him, panting. Something shifted in its gaze. It didn't strike again. Dalen groaned, clutching his side. "Cracked rib." "Maybe two." He fumbled for the tranquilizer, but his fingers wouldn't close properly. His arm was numb. Varrek didn't move. Dalen blinked up at the sky. "Great. This is how I die. Eaten by a patient." But Varrek didn't eat him. Instead, the creature turned, limped a few feet, then circled back and nudged Dalen with its snout. He groaned. "You want me to follow?" Varrek growled softly and began walking toward the ridge, pausing every few steps to glance back. "All right, fine. But you're carrying me if I pass out." Dalen staggered to his feet. Every breath hurt. His left wrist felt wrong, too loose. He suspected a fracture. The journey back took 2 hours. By the time they reached the facility perimeter, he was barely conscious. The med team rushed out, stunned to see Varrek at his side. Hecker met them at the entrance. "He didn't attack me," Dalen managed before collapsing. He woke in the infirmary, ribs tightly wrapped and wrist in a brace. A skin confirmed 2 fractured ribs and a distal radius fracture. The doctors estimated 4 to 6 weeks for full recovery. He wasn't allowed to return to the ward for 2 days. When he finally did, Varrek was in a reinforced enclosure, but no longer sedated. The creature stood when Dalen entered, watching him. "I keep telling them you're not a mindless killer," Dalen said, rubbing his ribs as he eased into a chair. Varrek padded closer to the barrier, then sat down. Hecker entered behind him. "There's talk of transferring the Graleth to a research facility," he said. "They'll dissect him." "Probably." Dalen stood slowly. "No, he's not a specimen. He's a survivor." "You're proposing what exactly?" "A rehabilitation protocol. Observation, gradual reintroduction to controlled environments. We can learn from him." Hecker considered it. "You're asking the council to change 3 decades of protocol. Then maybe it's time they did." The Kirell didn't respond, but he didn't argue either. Dalen returned every day, cast and all. He didn't try to tame Varrek. He didn't pretend they were friends. But trust grew, slow and quiet, until one day, Varrek let him touch the scar along his side without flinching. The staff began to watch with less suspicion. And in the corridors, whispers began to change. Not "he's crazy," but "maybe he's right." Saving one predator didn't change the galaxy, but it changed something. And that was enough. 3 weeks after Varrek's return from the ridge, the council sent an envoy. Not a message, not a recording. A person, a being draped in silken folds of solar reactive fabric, flanked by 2 guards in glinting exo-armor, all of them stepping off a transport with the kind of deliberateness that usually preceded bad news. The Kirell Med Dome had never seen anything like it. Most council communications arrived as dry directives on encrypted channels. This was theater. Dalen saw them from the observation deck, where he'd been feeding Varrek slices of rehydrated kelp moss through a retractable panel in the enclosure wall. The Graleth had learned not to lunge when food appeared. "Progress. Is it just me?" Dalen muttered. "Or do they look like they expect someone to bow?" Varrek snorted, then promptly sneezed on the glass. "Exactly." Downstairs, the guards scanned every corner of the facility with attention that made the staff go rigid. Vetrician Hecker intercepted them near the triage wing, his posture unreadable. Dalen arrived a minute later, wiping his hands on a towel. He nodded once to Hecker, who gave him the barest twitch of antennae in return. The envoy stepped forward. "I am Envoy Thassel of the Interstellar Xenomedical Ethics Council." "Dalen Prescott," he said, "Terran vet. You could have sent a memo." "We did. Twice. Your supervisor declined to forward them." Dalen glanced at Hecker, who didn't flinch. "Well, Dalen said. Now that you're here in person, I assume this is about the Graleth. Thassel didn't blink. It is about the breach of Article 17 of the Interspecies Containment Protocols, the unauthorized rehabilitation of a Category 5 predator, the violation of no less than 4 containment safety mandates, and more broadly, the implications of one Terran's unique disregard for established thresholds of risk. Nice to meet you too. We require an immediate behavioral assessment of the specimen. If it fails, it will be terminated. Dalen folded his arms. It's not a specimen. His name is Varrek. Thassel turned away. The evaluation will begin at 3rd rotation. That gave Dalen 5 hours. He went straight back to Varrek's enclosure, where the Graleth was pacing, claws clicking against the polymer floor. You've got a test coming up, Dalen said. And if you fail, they're going to put you down. Varrek tilted his head, then bared his teeth. Not hostile. Curious. Dalen opened the observation panel and tossed in a puzzle cube Kirell tech, pressure sensitive, scent activated. The Graleth had ignored it for 2 weeks. Today, he tapped it once, sniffed it, then rolled it under one paw. Good, Dalen muttered. Keep that up. He added a second object, a weighted sphere filled with nutrient gel that dispensed only when rotated just right. This time, Varrek didn't hesitate. He batted it once, then pinned it down and twisted. The gel oozed out in a thin stream. He licked it clean. By the time the assessment team arrived, Dalen had filled the enclosure with stimuli, textures, moving lights, scent trails, even audio triggers. Varrek had grown used to them, and this time, he didn't snarl when the observers entered the viewing chamber. Thassel stood at the front, flanked by a nervous-looking Ural technician holding a control tablet. Begin, Thassel said. The first test was recognition. A series of images flashed on the wall screen: predator silhouettes, prey silhouettes, neutral objects. Varrek focused on each in turn, tail swishing once, then settling. Next came the aggression triggers. A holographic projection of a hostile male Graleth appeared, snarling. Varrek tensed, then backed up a step and sat down. Thassel narrowed his eyes. The final test was direct interaction. Dalen had insisted on it. He entered the enclosure in full protective gear, carrying a med scanner and a synthetic bone fragment. He approached slowly, keeping his posture open. Varrek didn't growl. He sniffed the air, then padded forward and nudged Dalen's elbow. Hey, buddy, Dalen said. Mind if I check your ribs? He ran the scanner along Varrek's side. The bone had fused cleanly. No swelling. Scar tissue was minimal. Varrek licked his wrist brace. Don't get sentimental, Dalen said, stepping back. Thassel turned without a word and left the chamber. Dalen followed, yanking off his gloves. Well, Thassel stopped outside the containment door. The subject exhibits cognitive adaptability, emotional restraint, and non-aggressive response to stimuli. It exceeds the minimum threshold for bondable species reclassification. So he lives. For now, but he cannot stay here. We are relocating him to the Paxari Behavioral Research Facility. That's a death sentence. They'll drug him into a stupor and monitor brainwave decay until he flatlines. Thassel didn't answer. Dalen stepped in front of him. I'm not letting you take him. You don't have authority. Then I'm invoking the Terran Xenomedical Treaty of 8220. Section 9. Human personnel have the right to claim behavioral stewardship over any species they've rehabilitated, provided no fatalities occurred during recovery. That clause hasn't been used in over a century. Well, dust it off. Thassel's eyes shifted color, a sign of irritation in his species. You're assuming the Council will side with you. I'm assuming they'll want to avoid a diplomatic incident with Earth's medical alliance. A long silence stretched between them. Finally, Thassel's shoulders dropped a fraction. Very well. You may retain custody provisionally. You will transport the subject to a neutral facility. You will document every interaction. Should any incident occur, the Council reserves the right to override your claim. Deal. That night, Dalen sat alone in his quarters, reviewing footage from the evaluation. Varrek had responded to every cue with precision. Not perfect, but deliberate. Intentional. Someone knocked. Hecker entered holding a data tablet. I've been reviewing your logs, he said. The Graleth's olfactory responses are more advanced than we thought. He's tracking hormonal signatures. I noticed that. He avoids people with high cortisol levels. He also mirrors your posture. Subtly. Bonding behavior? Possibly. Or mimicry. Either way, it's not instinctive. Dalen took the tablet, scrolling through Hecker's notes. This could change how we classify predator cognition across the board. We've been wrong about more than just the Graleth. Dalen looked up. You mean the whole classification system? Hecker nodded. Our definitions are based on fear. Yours are based on potential. It's disorienting. Welcome to the human condition. 2 days later, the transfer shuttle arrived. Not a council vessel Terran registry, civilian spec. Dalen loaded Varrek into a reinforced transport cradle lined with memory foam and scent-neutral fabric. No sedatives. Just trust. Varrek growled once when the engine spun up, then settled. The new facility was a converted orbital station, small, quiet, off-grid. Dalen had negotiated it through Earth's diplomatic back channels. Officially, it didn't exist. Unofficially, it was now the galaxy's first interspecies behavioral rehabilitation center. He was the only staff member. The first week, Varrek explored the habitat chamber, sniffing every vent and corner. Dalen installed enrichment units, rotating stimuli every 72 hours. Feeding schedules shifted to mimic wild cycles. Sleep logs showed increased REM activity. By the second week, Varrek no longer reacted to sudden movement. By the third, he began vocalizing short, low-frequency pulses that matched Dalen's speech cadence. Dalen began recording everything. On the 24th day, he left the door to the habitat open. Varrek didn't move. He waited 10 minutes, then stepped out and followed Dalen to the observation lounge. He curled up under the table and slept. That night, Dalen sent a message to the council. No demands, no reports, just a single line. He stayed. The emergency klaxon wailed at second shift change, a shrill pulse that rattled the ceiling panels and sent a tray of nutrient samples skittering across the lab floor. Dalen dropped the calibration 1 mid-cycle and sprinted to the central chamber, his boots thudding against the grid flooring. Inside the habitat, Varrek was thrashing. The Graleth's limbs convulsed in erratic bursts, paws gouging the padded floor as his sides heaved. A low, guttural sound rumbled in his throat, less a growl than a choked, involuntary vibration. His eyes were wide, unfocused. Foam flecked the corners of his mouth. Dalen didn't hesitate. He slapped the emergency override, disabling the secondary door locks, and ducked into the chamber without waiting for the containment clearance to cycle. The air inside was thick with ozone and musk. Varrek's scent glands had activated in distress. Lights to 40%, Dalen barked, and the chamber dimmed instantly. He knelt beside the Graleth, keeping low and angled to avoid the flailing limbs. Varrek. Hey, focus. It's Dalen. You're not under attack. Your vitals are spiking like a seizure, but your pupils aren't responsive. What the hell is this? He tapped his wrist pad and initiated a local bioscan. Neural activity was off the charts. The readings suggested a massive surge in hypothalamic output, but without the usual neurochemical cascade that followed aggression or fear. Dreaming, the Graleth's chest seized again. No, this isn't REM. This is... Varrek stopped thrashing. He let out a single, low huff and went completely still. Dalen reached forward, 2 fingers extended, and touched the pulse point beneath the jawbone. Still strong. Fast, but steady. He exhaled slowly and sat back on his heels. 10 minutes later, Varrek opened his eyes. The Graleth stared at him for several long seconds, then pulled himself upright with slow, deliberate movements. He shook once, like a soaked animal, and padded to the water station to gulp down half the reservoir. Dalen didn't speak until the drinking stopped. You're going to have to be a little more specific next time your brain decides to overload. Varrek looked at him, gave a short exhale, and licked the back of his own paw. Yeah. I'll add it to the file. By early evening, Dalen had compiled a full report. The event didn't match any known Graleth neurological patterns. He ran the data through 3 separate xenological networks, but none returned a match. He sent the results to Earth's Neuroadaptive Research Division, flagged as urgent. The reply came 6 hours later, encoded and signed by a human neurologist stationed in the Vega Belt. Preliminary analysis suggests induced memory loop, possibly artificial. Have you scanned for implants? Dalen blinked twice and swore. He hadn't. The next morning, he sedated Varrek with a mild vapor compound, nothing heavy, just enough to keep the Graleth compliant, and ran a full-body resonance scan. There it was. A faint metallic signature embedded behind the cranial ridge. Microscopic. Too small to be surgical. Likely airborne delivery. The device had nestled itself just under the dermal layer, interfacing with the occipital lobe. Why would anyone implant a predator with a neural loop trigger? Dalen muttered, pacing the edge of the lab. Varrek's breathing was steady in the recovery unit, but even unconscious, his claws twitched. Dalen activated the sterilization tray and snapped on surgical gloves. Well, let's find out. The extraction was delicate. The device was partially fused to a nerve cluster, and any sudden movement risked permanent damage. Dalen used microforceps and kept the area flooded with neurostabilizing gel. It took 47 minutes. When he pulled the device free, it was smaller than a fingernail. A dull gray chip with no markings. He sealed the incision and flushed the wound with antibiotic mist. Varrek stirred as the anesthesia wore off. Dalen held the chip up to the light. You've been carrying a trigger bomb in your head. Someone wanted you to lose control. Varrek's pupils narrowed as he blinked blearily. I'm not putting this in the report, Dalen said, dropping the chip into a lead-line containment pod. They'd never let you walk free again. Varrek's gaze followed the pod as Dalen locked it into the security drawer. That evening, a supply shuttle docked with the station. The pilot, a wiry woman with a crooked nose and a Terran logistics badge, handed Dalen a manifest and a single, unmarked parcel. No return address, she said. Showed up in the dispatch queue like it had clearance above mine. Dalen took the box. It was heavy. No external markings. He opened it in the lab, alone. Inside was a sealed canister. And inside that, a printed image old-school ink on polymer. It showed Varrek upright, snarling in a cage surrounded by armored handlers. A tiny human child stood outside the bars, hand pressed to the glass. On the back of the image, a single phrase was etched in stylus. Control what fears you first. He stared at it for a long time. Then he burned it. 3 days later, the council official returned. This time, Envoy Thassel arrived in a civilian transport, alone. Dalen met him in the docking corridor. I didn't request a follow-up. This isn't official. Then why are you here? Thassel looked exhausted. There's been a shift in council priorities. They're evaluating whether rehabilitation centers like this one should receive funding. Based on what? Based on whether they work. Dalen didn't respond. He led Thassel through the corridor and into the habitat chamber. Varrek was sprawled on a sun-warmed platform, eyes half-lidded. He rose when they entered, but didn't growl. Instead, he approached slowly and sat. Thassel watched in silence. Dalen crouched and offered a flat palm. Varrek dropped his head into it. You want a definition of success? Dalen asked. There. Thassel didn't speak for a long time. When he finally did, his voice was quiet. The vote's in 2 weeks. I'll submit this visit as a personal observation. No guarantees. That's more than I had yesterday. Thassel paused at the door. You still think he's just a patient? Dalen shook his head. No. He's my colleague. After the envoy left, Dalen sat beside the enclosure and watched Varrek settle back onto the platform. The Graleth's breathing was slow, calm. No tremors. No twitches. Nothing but quiet. He uploaded the final entry into the system log. Subject has exhibited consistent behavior within human interaction thresholds. Neural loop device has been removed. No further episodes recorded. Species classification remains under review. Recommend rehabilitated companion designation for independent evaluation. He submitted the report. Then he deleted every backup of the implant scan, because some things didn't need to be archived. That night, he opened Varrek's enclosure. The Graleth padded out, circled once, and lay at Dalen's feet. No alarms sounded. No protocols triggered. Just 2 survivors on a station no one believed would last. They did.